when walking out the door, look at the mirror and take one thing off, one accessory that you're wearing. And that's what I often tell their writers to do, to look at your piece again and take off another accessory.
Ron McCullom is a successful science writer, and not just because he knows his subjects. He also knows how to convey information succinctly. On this episode of the Journalism Salute, Rod talks about that, his beat, and much more. Hi, and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's show, we're joined by Rod McCullom. Rod is a freelance science and technology writer who has been published in many different places, including but not limited to Scientific American, Time Magazine, and The Atlantic. He previously worked for ABC News and was a Knight Institute Research Fellow at MIT. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
My first question is the same as it is for every guest that we have. Can you tell us the story of your journalism path?
Yeah, interesting question, because I'm asked this many times, and each time I'm asked, I realize I have the same core answer, but I expand on it depending upon the audience. So years and years ago, I wanted to be, everyone grows up wanting to be something. And I grew up in the 70s. So space travel, of course, was a big thing then, and I was really interested in space, not necessarily in terms of just the vastness, but the logistics. How did they get there? How do you, and how they send photos, back from the moon. So I was really interested in things like that, and also medical technology, like X-rays and things like that. So I went to university. I'm sorry, and also at the same time, I love for writing as well. So when I was a kid, when I was young, I would write stories, that no one really was going to read besides a teacher, maybe just about astronauts or engineers working on a rocket plane or something, a rocket or something like that, or doctors discovering some new virus. So I had these two loves of science, and also of writing. So when I went to university, the science didn't work out well for me, and I wanted to go to medical school or grad school to be a scientist, or obviously medical school to be a physician. But I still had this love of science and appreciation for science. So I went into more of my other love, which was writing. And at that time, which would be like the early 1990s, the HIV/AIDS crisis was, in full force. And I wrote a piece for a magazine on a major demonstration here in Chicago against a pharmaceutical, against what they were charging for their for the HIV drug. And I realized at that time that I had a gift for explaining science to non-scientists. So it just sort of took off from there. I worked for a magazine or two. I worked on at the LA Times briefly, and went into television. I was working at NBC and ABC. I'm here in Chicago and in New York. And but my love was always writing, was always print. So I got back into writing for print probably like the late 2000s or so, and mostly went into health, and then of course all into science and technology, and that's where we are today.
I'd be remiss not to ask you about your TV career, your TV production career. Were there any skills that you learned in that field that are still applicable for you today?
That's actually a very good question as well. I'm glad you asked that, because I think the short answer is yes. I feel that I was able to be successful in both, because I was able to compartmentalize and but also bring skills into each situation, sort of like code switching or speaking multiple languages. What I learned and I appreciate the most in television news was the video in terms of telling the story. So one thing that I learned, that I value when I returned to writing for print, and of course in digital later, was illustrating the story by words. Of course in television it's with photos and videos, and in print and in digital, of course, we do it with words. So bringing up the best pieces of the story early. So that really works as well in science. Also personal narratives as well, because those are really strong in television. And I learned the importance of those when I returned to writing for print and also going into digital. It's the power of personal human stories.
Yep, and you certainly see those on television
Yes.
plenty. On your Content Lee page, you have about 50 examples of your work posted, and what I thought was cool was they are listed under 20-something categories. So you really run the gamut as far as science goes. And just to give
Yeah.
you a couple of examples of the kinds
Okay.
of stories that you do, how bullying affects the brain. Literally, the brain changes, anxiety becomes more likely. You did
Yes.
stories, as you mentioned, on HIV and HIV vaccines. Your fingerprints can show if you've done drugs. That was a fascinating
Right.
story done by analyzing the sweat on your
Yes.
on your fingertips. And
Yes.
then racial disparities in the pandemic, specifically related to artificial intelligence algorithms on multiple fronts, including
Right.
a diagnosing algorithm being able to identify health issues on dark skin. All right, that's a
Right.
lot of different things there. How
Yeah,
do you
it
come up
is.
with your story ideas?
It is. It is. And thank you for catching that. It's sort of interesting. Like in a what 2 sentences? I mean, basically, within 30 seconds, you sort of ran down to me. My core areas, my core focus areas,
Yep.
are artificial intelligence, biometrics, brain and cognitive sciences, um, infectious disease slash epidemiology, and the science of crime, trauma, and violence. And if I can find a story that can combine all of those or many of those together, I think it's a good day. And I think if you look back over the stories that you just read or the stories that you just cited, you see that they all basically fall within those frameworks. It might seem very broad, but um, I try to dig deep in a limited subject area. If you notice, I don't go into things such as space or biology, climate, environment. And a lot of those I'm just not really strong at. So I feel why I should at this point, I would rather deepen, my understanding and report stronger as opposed to taking on more core areas, if that makes any sense.
Sure,
Mm-hmm.
it does. So, how does a story idea come about for you?
How the story idea come up? Right. Thank you. I forgot to explain that. Basically, it's curiosity. And sometimes I might be walking down the street and see something, or sometimes it might be on YouTube and something might pop up. Isn't this interesting? For instance, you mentioned a story about fingerprint analysis in terms of drug use. I was actually on YouTube one day, and I don't know, I was just in a YouTube rabbit hole, and I saw a clip about I saw a YouTube clip on. It's from a local. It was from one of the news channels in Great Britain. There's a short clip just for their news. I guess someone was just recording the news, but the reader, we call them anchors here, was saying that they had some interesting news about a new scientific discovery around drug use and fingerprints. So there was nothing more in the broadcast, but that sort of intrigued me. So I just made a note of it, and I did some research. I just went online for a little bit and realized that there were two research teams based in Great Britain that are conducting this research on fingerprint drug analysis. And the way I like to look at news or science news is not necessarily what's happening today, but what could be happening 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So I think, for instance, there could be a good discussion around the viability of drug testing via fingerprints, of course, because it could be done to people without their knowledge, And that became one of the issues as well in my reporting. So I like to look for stories that are underreported, especially those that can have an impact on a wide audience, or stories that will science and technology stories that will impact marginalized communities.
One of those that you wrote about recently. Can you take us through it from idea to completion? How
Mm-hmm.
wearable artificial intelligence could help you recover from COVID?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting you would cite that story.
Sure.
It's interesting you would cite that story because I'm pitching another piece on wearable technology to MIT Technology Review, and I was working actually on that piece today. So that story came a different way. Another way that I also often find science news or technology news articles are just on subscribing to different email lists. And sometimes I'll subscribe to email lists of different aggregator sites. You've probably seen those.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some news aggregator sites, science news aggregator sites that email that I subscribe to because they constantly have PR, PR releases coming out from different companies, different research companies, or different universities. So I got an email one day about just the possibility of using wearable technology um, to to treat COVID, long-term COVID patients. This sounds interesting. So I looked at the research, I looked at the PR, the news release, and it was about a product, coming from a company. There's this company that was based in the Chicago area and that had done a lot of work apparently in other wearable technologies and other technologies around health. And they had a pilot program going on in Chicago, where I'm based actually, and they had some good success to it. So I looked it up. I looked at that program. I looked up more in the company. I looked up more on the field of wearable technologies in COVID, and learned that there's actually a lot going on. It's just different pilot programs here, there, and everywhere. Some of the studies are small, some are larger, some are having a big impact, some are having a small impact. So I thought, how could I do this? Because in a different way. So I talked with the editors at MIT Technology Review. They were very excited about it. I also talked with the communication staff at the University of Illinois Hospital, and also at the company that made this technology. And it's not the wearable sensor, because basically what happens is a person experiences COVID, and after they leave the hospital, they're sent home with a biosensor patch that can capture heart rate, respiratory rate, stress, and other things. And when any of those biometrics, or rather, when any of those data at a certain critical level, then the nurses, at the hospital are alerted, and they can call a doctor, or they can call an advanced nurse practitioner, and who will talk to the patient, or rather the person who's recovering at home, and say, are you stressed? What's happening to you right now? Or, in some cases, we think you need to go to the emergency room right now. And the story was very interesting because the company that designs the sensors actually had began designing sensors for jet engines. So it's the same sort of technology that's used in jet engines, for example, or I guess, or locomotives, that can tell, when an engine's overheating, or when it needs, more hydraulic fluid that's been applied to the human body. So I just thought that was a really fascinating story.
Now, you published that in June, and what struck me is I feel like I'm someone who's really kept up on COVID everything over the last year and a half, and I don't know anything more about it beyond what I read in your article. Is there anything to update from that piece?
Yes. It seems that the pilot program is being expanded to several other hospitals, and there may be some news on an FDA clearance that would allow this technology to be used in by many more people. That hasn't been confirmed yet. So on just the short of it, but the short end of it is yes, the program has been expanded to more hospitals in the Chicago area.
Excellent. One thing that struck me too, from reading that piece and reading one or two others that you wrote, you're able to say a lot in a short amount of space. Like, I never felt like any of your pieces were particularly long. And yet some of them are a little longer, but not terribly.
Yes.
I'm curious how you managed to condense everything without making sure, A, to get everything in, but not being too complicated in how you write.
Right. Thank you. Yes, that is an acquired skill. And I'm very flattered you've noticed that, because editors have commented on that as well. That sort of, I feel that goes back to my television production, news production background. And I remember years ago working on a news piece in television. And I'm sorry, before I worked in television, I worked for the Los Angeles Times, and I wrote for magazines. And I used to write these long pieces. And I remember, of course, when I got into television, you don't have that luxury. And I was working a piece, and it's too long. And I remember I was working with this managing editor, and he's went through it, and he just looked at it, this is just too long. He said, okay, what are the most important things you need to say? Think about that first, and also think about what you can take away from it that won't hurt. And he told me something that I hadn't heard before, but he's like, you know who Coco Chanel was? And I was like, this is like, just, the managing editor who's like this, baseball fan and sports guy. And I said, yeah, Coco Chanel, the designer, right? He's like, right, right. He said she gave some really great advice once that I always tell my writers, and it was to women, and this is back in the 20s or 30s. When walking out the door, look at the mirror and take one thing off, one accessory that you're wearing. And that's what I often tell their writers to do, to look at your piece again and take off another accessory. So what I have learned, and I believe I've gotten very skillful at telling these type of stories, as you're describing, especially when reporting on science and technology, oftentimes it's not what you say, but it's what you don't say that makes the story more compelling. It's not too difficult to write about something in 3,000 or 4,000 words because you have the luxury of space and time. But if you have only 1,500 words or 1,000 words, that's going to make it more challenging that you can convey the most information in an accessible format without without the reader feeling he's lost at sea. So that's what I do try to do.
So you write a column for Undark, a magazine that explores how science interacts with politics, economics, and culture. Your focus is on the science of crime and the criminal justice system. We talked about fingerprints before. Things like racial bias and facial recognition, gunfire detection technology, lots of other things. Do you have a piece within those that you particularly liked that you can share with us?
We were talking about the fingerprint analysis, fingerprint drug analysis, and that was an Undark column. We posted the Atlantic and somewhere else, I think. There's several pieces several columns in my Undark column that I feel really strongly about, and I'm actually working on right now. Today, not right now as I'm talking to you, but right now, this week, I am writing a new column. I really like the first column I did for Undark on my first convictions column, which was on the epidemiology of gun violence in Chicago. I'm based in Chicago now, so there's something personal there as well. And there was new data that shows how much gun violence can be seen as a contagion, in terms of like catching a cold,
Mm-hmm.
So, that's something I've always been fascinated about, just in terms of when people see violence or exposed to violence, how does that make them more likely to do it themselves? And there's actually a lot of research that shows that. So I really like that. I like my piece on facial recognition, which I believe is my second column, or maybe my third, because it's actually the first, I believe, Science News article that actually questioned. Not only, of course, it's been documented that there is a racial bias in facial recognition. But my question in the column was, why isn't anyone studying this? And at that time, which was 2017, I believe there had only been two studies documenting racial bias in facial recognition. So there's more awareness of it now, and there's probably more studies of it right now. But at that time, there wasn't much reporting, or even less any reporting on the lack of research around it. So I feel very good because that column for Undark was nominated for a Science and Society Award from the National Science Writers Association. So I feel good about that. Of course, I like the fingerprint drug analysis one. And I like the one I did more recently last year. I think two I did last year. One was on tasers, on how the number of taser incidents against teens and younger children has not been documented. And I like that because, there's no documentation, and it just sort of asks some questions. And the other piece I really liked, the other column I really enjoyed, was the column around COVID disparities and jail cycling, the Cook County Jail. There's research that came out last year that showed that sort of a strong association between jail cycling, leaving the jail, and corresponding COVID rates in neighborhoods. So the theory that the researchers were pushing was that they're catching COVID inside Cook County Jail and probably other jails as well. They're only in there for a week or two, and they return to their home communities and don't know that they have COVID. And that's how it's brought into the community. And that caused a lot of discussion in that paper as well. Of course, Cook County Jail has changed a lot of its methods and practices around that. But it's a very interesting theory, especially when you look at how, as we know, incarceration rates are much, much, much higher in Black communities, and
Yep.
COVID-19 is as well.
In your piece that you just mentioned a second ago on the tasing of kids, you asked the
Mm-hmm.
Chicago police for comment. They referred
Right.
you to Chicago public schools and vice
Yeah.
versa. That's an example of a bureaucratic challenge that I think reporters deal with across all different fields. I'm curious, what are some other challenges that you encounter in your reporting?
Thanks for picking it up, by the way. When you emailed me about it, I was like, oh, wow, he really is reading the articles. Um, yeah. Yeah, so interesting because I had a suspicion the Chicago Police Department and Chicago Public Schools would not tell me the full story, and that turned out to be true. But what's interesting in terms of my perspective, like being a science journalist, is oftentimes I found um, some police agencies just don't want to talk to me. Or some law enforcement agencies just don't want to talk to me, and they'll talk to other journalists and other reporters, and that's probably because of the general interest news reporters. And if they read my work, they can see that I'm probably going to ask a lot of questions that they don't want to answer. So that happens. Chicago Police also, come to think of it, yeah, I've reached out to Chicago Police on like maybe 3 stories, and no one's ever has returned a call. So that's not surprising. So this is something I knew just wanted to grapple with, but it is what it is.
Gotcha. You
Mhm.
you had the experience being a fellow at MIT. What did you get out
Yes.
of that experience?
Yes. That was actually one of the highlights of my journalism career so far, being a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. Um, I really, really enjoyed the experience. I got a lot out of it. Um, I told myself going in that I wanted to take some classes and learn what I could about artificial. I mean, this is a 1 year opportunity, so I want to maximize it. So I really wanted to learn as much as I could about AI, not just in terms of coding, but just also just in terms of ethics, and 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 how it impacts our daily lives. So I took several courses there at MIT, and it's really happy being there. It was a special time. Met some really great people. Deborah Blum, who was the leader of the program, who was the director of the program, is a fantastic science journalist. Was a fantastic Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. So she's a great mentor. Tom Zeller, uh, who's there as well, and also as the editor in chief of Undark, was just a great mentor there as well. There's some really strong people who've been through the program.
Yeah, MIT is fantastic. I have been there on a couple of occasions for sporting events.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic place to visit, certainly.
Right.
In our last episode, Kalundra Smith, who's a theater and culture writer, said that there are fewer than 24 Black theater critics across the
Mm.
United States. And I saw
Mm-hmm.
a call on Twitter about a year ago for Black science writers to identify
Mm-hmm.
themselves.
Right.
A few did, but it
Yes, you
was
did.
not a long list.
Right. It's not a long list. Yes. Yeah. Then also it was interesting. As far as I know, well, my knowledge is not perfect, of course, but I will say that there are fewer Black science journalists, but I'm not surprised because there's fewer, African American journalists across the spectrum, and I'm saying African American for a particular reason, because or Black for a particular reason, because too often times journalists group Blacks and with other non-whites and use the term POC, um, person of color. But there's a very big difference, And I've talked about this before. I don't particularly like being described as a person of color. I mean, I'm African American or I'm Black. But the difference is, and the problem, and maybe you can see it from my perspective, is saying person of color assumes that we all have the same experiences. And I would say that we do not. A Black man or Black woman, an African American man or woman, reporting on artificial intelligence or you know neuroscience is not going to be seen the same as I don't know, an Asian doing it or a white person.
Are you willing to share any I guess situations you had? I mentioned challenges that you've had to encounter in your reporting. Are there any that you're willing to acknowledge with regards to that?
Not necessarily.
Yeah,
I
okay.
mean, there's a few things that happen. I mean, um, a few eyebrows are raised. I mean, for instance, was when you said earlier when you were describing about just the um, diversity of topics I cover, from AI to the science of violence or something like that. And you were just acknowledging that as journalist to journalist,
Yep.
but I do know for a fact that some journalists or some editors might think, why is he covering AI? What does he know about it? That sort of thing. There's a professor named Mark Neal who is at Duke University. Mark Neal wrote a book, I think about 10 years ago, called Looking for Leroy. And the Leroy was the character in Fame. Do you remember the television show and the movie Fame?
I do, absolutely.
Right. Remember, so Leroy with the cornrows?
Yep.
Right, right. So, and this is a really interesting book just in terms of how black men are viewed in different spaces in the world. And he had a really good example. And I always bring this up because when I asked about it, in terms of a black man with a basketball versus a violin. And he says if if the average person sees a black teenager or a black young man with a basketball walking down the street, they'll instantly think he's a basketball player because that is a comfortable image for them. That's something they've seen many, many times before. You know, but if it's a young black boy or a teenager black boy walking with a violin case, then people will look into it and think, how did he get that violin? Does he really know how to play it? How did he learn to play it? Is it any good? So I'll say I've seen this many times over the years, having worked in print, having worked in television, now working in print and digital, working in science news per se, um, that oftentimes, and you probably know this as well, black journalists and black reporters are tracked in certain fields or certain niches.
Mm-hmm.
Years ago in newspapers, me the black reporters were always put into on the metro desk, or sports, right? Black
Yep.
reporters are always in sports, right? But if you see them covering investigations, I mean, it would be rare to see a black person, in the I unit, and it still is today. I mean, of course, there's many changes now and many changes today, but I mean, I mean, we all have war stories. I don't have any particularly bad ones working in science news. I would say that working in science news actually has been liberating in many ways because I feel my talents have been appreciated. Um, for the most part, because I feel I have a lot to offer. Oh, here we go. You asked for a story. Okay, so I'll give a story. And this just came up just recently. So there's a certain journalist who was interviewing me, who wanted to interview me for a piece that they were doing. And so I said, okay, great. So they set some time in the interview, and we set the interview time, and we did an interview. And then later, they called me back and they said, I don't know. I don't know. Thank you for talking with me, but I don't know who will use your comments. And I'm like, oh, did you change your anger or something like that? And she said, no, just to be honest, I think I booked too many people. I said, okay, fine. That happens to me all the time. Anyway, when the article came out, uh, I just looked over the several people who were quoted, and I got the distinct impression that one of the persons quoting the article, perhaps wanted to control who else was quoted. If you understand what I'm saying,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sure. So do you have any work coming out soon that is of particular interest? I know that you're working on a chapter for a textbook. I'm curious what else you're working on.
Right. So I am working on a chapter in a textbook that is the working title, I believe, is the MIT Night Science Journalism tactical. I'm sorry, the MIT the tactical guide to science journalism. It's being produced more or less by MIT Science Journalism, and it's being published by Oxford University Press. I believe the pub date is fall 2022, so later this year, but I could be mistaken. So my chapter, and I've contributed to several books before. This is my first time in a textbook. My chapter is in the section on beat reporting. How to craft your beat. So in my chapter, I give a lot of examples on how I crafted a beat in the science, reporting on the science of crime.
Excellent. When that comes out, certainly be sure to let us know. What are the challenges of being freelance, and what advice do you have for someone choosing to be freelance?
Yeah, the challenges, of course, always are getting paid or having sustainable income, and those are, I think, not going anywhere anytime soon, especially with this economy now that more of us who have staff jobs don't have them anymore, so we're freelancing. And it's not that it's necessarily a quality issue, but it's mostly, I feel, just in terms of the economics of the business are different now, and also there's a price point at a certain point that probably just becomes untenable for some businesses some media outlets to hire better writers, reporters who have tenure, and who have broad experience, because they will want more money. So what I would suggest for anyone wanting to become a freelance writer is to think very carefully about it. Is this something that you need to do, and how should you do it? I don't recommend anyone quit their job, right away. Just quit their job and say they're going to write, unless they have a trust fund or something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a full-time job and writing occasionally on the side. Now that will mean oftentimes that some magazines won't want to hire you, or some publications won't want to hire you. So I think it's a balancing act, because, for instance, some of the science magazines say that you have to be a full-time science writer, or no good, and I can understand that to a certain degree, but I would caution everyone first: why do you want to do this, and do you need to do this? I also would suggest that anyone wanting to be a writer in general, or a freelance writer in particular, is trying to build your portfolio so that you specialize in something, so that people know that you're going to do something really, really well, and try to pick something that's underappreciated or underreported. Most of the pieces that I report, I think you can say you've probably never seen anywhere else, and I try to keep it that way. I try to keep it that way and make myself that's my unique selling point. So I think having a USP in business is always a great thing.
Yep, I certainly I said that multiple times as I was looking at your stuff. Boy, I haven't seen this before. All right, last question. Is there a person or organization, journalism related, that you're not affiliated with that you'd like to salute for their good work?
Yes and no. I'm not right now. I'm actually not a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. I was before, but I really, and that's nothing. That's nothing. That's just that was just me forgetting to sign up again. I'll actually do it probably this week. But I do want to give them a shout out, because they're doing great work. They're creating pipelines for young talent in newsrooms, which we desperately need. So I really, really appreciate that.
Rod McCullom, thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck in your work.
Thank you so much, Mark Simon.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter @JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.